We're now in a position to return to stress as a topic again, having looked at it earlier in connection with syllables and having looked at intonation. We can take a final look at it, and we'll notice that, and we've already noticed that earlier, that speakers perceive some syllables to be more prominent. We've just said that they're perceived as more prominent. Wherein does that prominence lie? We would think perhaps that it's because they're louder, and that's obviously a factor, but it's not the only one. For example, the length of the syllable has an effect on whether it's perceived as prominent. Certainly loudness has an effect. The pitch as well. Stressed syllables tend to have a slightly higher pitch than others, and the quality of the vowel has an effect. As we'll see later, when syllables are not stressed, things happen to the vowel quality in their middle. So if you're listening to someone, then if a syllable is stressed, it may have a different vowel quality. Well, let's just check up again on the way in which we can hunt for stress, and all of us are able to do that. In the word industrial, we have industrial. We have 4 syllables, and one of those is the most prominent. We could say industrial. Well, that isn't right. We could say industrial, and that sounds good. We could say industrial, and that sounds terrible. And we could say industrial, and that is also terrible. Dust is clearly the syllable that is most prominent. That's the primary stressed syllable. What about obligation? Well, there it's gay, obligation. And explanation, it's the aish syllable that's the most prominent. So for every word spoken in isolation, there is one syllable that has the primary stress, that is accented, that we hear as more prominent, and the other syllables have lesser degrees of stress. And there are some syllables that are unstressed. We're only going to recognize 3 degrees of stress. In the 1940s and 50s, some linguists recognized 5 degrees of stress, and it became quite tricky finding out just how different one syllable was from another. 3 is doable. How do we notate it? Well, the primary stress, the one that a word has in isolation that gives it its biggest oomph, that's done by a raised mark at the beginning of the syllable. For a secondary stress, there is a low mark at the beginning of the syllable. So if we look at explanation, the nash syllable has the main stress, explanation, and x also has some degree of stress, explanation, and the pl has no stress and the shin has no stress. They're unstressed, so they have no marks at all. No mark doesn't mean there's no stress, it means it's very weakly stressed, unstressed if you like, but there's got to be some degree of emphasis. Right, so 3 degrees of stress. So what happens in connected speech as opposed to in individual words? Well, stress doesn't quite fall on every syllable in the same way as it does in individual words, but stress patterns definitely happen, and they give rhythm to connected speech. Intonation, of course, gives melody to connected speech, and stress gives rhythm to connected speech. Some words are commonly completely unstressed in connected speech. For example, th, and and f. If we say them on their own, we say the and and for, and they all have one primary stress. But if we put them into a sentence, we frequently say th and f. They get almost no stress at all. There's something interesting about stress. Languages have ways of placing stress a certain distance apart. In English, the distance apart between stressed syllables is roughly equal. The rhythm of an English sentence is determined by this process. It's called stress timing. So if we look at the sentence in English, the approximate blah blah blah, and imagine that there's a metronome going on. In English, the approximate period between primary stressed syllables is equal. And we get very much the same kind of beat going through there, regardless of how many syllables there are between the stressed syllables. In English, the approximate period between primary stressed syllables is equal. This is called stress timing. Well, that's not the case, for example, in French, where each syllable is given about the same amount of time. In English, the approximate period between primary stressed syllables is equal. Putting on my allo accent. That's not got the same rhythm at all. And it's very interesting that when you're learning a new language, if it happens to be stress timed, it's very difficult for you to manage a syllable timing in another language and vice versa. Switching syllable timings, stress timings, is difficult. It takes quite a long time before that becomes natural. Well, something happens when a syllable is unstressed. Often the vowel quality changes, and we can see this when we add some morphology. Look at the word derive. Derive. The stress is on rive, I, and that has the diphthong, I. But if we put an ATION on the end, we suddenly get derivation, derivation, and the I has changed to derivation. In other words, when you take the stress off a syllable, the vowel quality tends to change. That can get to the point where the vowel can even be elided altogether. No vowel appears. And we mentioned this when we mentioned syllabic consonants. It's not that there wasn't a vowel there originally. It's just that when the stress is taken off that vowel, then the vowel can disappear, and then all that's left is the consonant, which is the remainder. If we say this with equal stress on both syllables, we would say lesson, lesson, 2 syllables, and there is a vowel in the second one, lesson. But frequently, when we're speaking quickly, we say listen, sn, sn. We go straight from the S to the N, and the N becomes a syllabic consonant because a vowel has been elided. Pedal, pedal, 2 syllables, pedal, and there's no vowel in the second syllable. The L has become a syllabic nucleus. Well, now we can put some of this together and look at a traditional literary device, the device of meter. Meter is a literary device based on the fact that language has rhythm. And again, in a lot of Western poetical forms, poetry has meter. Just as it has rhyme schemes, it also has meter. Meter, like rhyme schemes, are a kind of template. This time, instead of being rhyming ends of syllables, we have the timing of each syllable and the number of them to a line. So there are 2 aspects. How many stressed syllables are there to a line of poetry, and what is the sequence of stressed to unstressed syllables? And these are called feet, sequences of stressed and unstressed syllables. Well, line lengths, if there are only 2 stressed syllables to a line, it's called dimeter. No prizes for guessing if there are 3 that it'll be trimeter and tetrameter and pentameter and hexameter, and after that we get heptameter and octameter and nonameter and decameter and so on. But in Western poetry, hexameters is about as far as it goes. Traditional Greek oral poetry is in hexameters. So what about the sequences, the feet? If we have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, as in the word alone, that's called an iamb, alone. The opposite way round is called a trochee, lonely, lonely. An anapaest consists of 2 unstressed syllables with a final stressed syllable. Intercede. And a dactyl is the opposite way around. Terrible, 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 terrible. These rhythms have been used since the, well, certainly since the Renaissance period, and all English poetry until relatively recently used these metrical patterns. So, what happens? Well, no good poem's rhythm totally adheres to its meter, otherwise it would be boring. The couplets that we saw earlier, the 18th century couplets, were in iambic pentameter. That is, roughly they went dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. That was one line. And then the same again for the next line. But Alexander Pope, for example, says, "True ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learnt to dance." Well, that doesn't quite do that dee-dum thing, although there are 10 syllables to a line, and there is a rhyming couplet at the end, chance and dance. Shakespeare, for example, in most of his plays uses iambic pentameter. Occasionally the yokels break into ordinary speech, but all his important people speak in iambic pentameter. Their lines don't rhyme, but if you count the lines, then you'll find that there are almost always 10 syllables to a line and 5 stressed syllables in that line, and occasionally they go dee-dum, 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 but not very often. Mostly they don't, because while that's the template, it's much more interesting if you don't exactly follow the template. So, here are the first 2 lines of Richard III. And this is the meter. And this is what you don't say. "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York." That would be the opening if you are following the meter. But of course, while that's the template, this is what you might say. "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York." And you'll notice that if you count the number of syllables, there are "now is the winter," 10, and glorious summer. But yeah, there are 10, but the stresses don't exactly go dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. So, all of us produce rhythm all the time, and the occasional poet 100 years ago would produce meter as well. But of course the interesting thing about traditional poetry is this tension between rhythm and meter. In modern poetry, free verse, that tension doesn't exist for the most part because there is no meter. You're free to do whatever you like. However, those of you who feel like writing a Shakespearean play in iambic pentameter can try that. Alfred Lord Tennyson in the middle of the 19th century wrote a number of plays in iambic pentameter. They were terrible.